Hi everyone, my name is Nishima Chudasama and I'm the Director of Programs at Nest Foundation. I wanted to welcome you to today's teacher workshop. We'll be focusing on how to support young people during this pandemic, but first I'd like to just share a little bit about who we are. Nest Foundation is a nonprofit that's dedicated to ending violence against children. We primarily do this by bringing prevention education materials, including a curriculum, teacher training, parent materials, and student leadership opportunities to schools around the country. During this time, we know it's especially important that all of you as educators and counselors feel supported in the work that you're doing to reach out to students and do what you always do, which is to ensure that their well-being is front and center. We wanted to provide this resource as part of our first series of workshops that will be continuing from this point on. And today I'm welcoming Corianna Sichel, who will be leading the workshop and sharing some tools in helping you to navigate this moment and support kids as best as possible. I'll be on at the end, and I'm welcoming Corianna now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishima. As Nishima mentioned, my name is Corianna Sichel, and I'm a psychology fellow in the Division of Prevention and Community Research at the Yale School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry. I'm also currently affiliated with NYU, having just completed my doctoral studies in counseling psychology at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. I've worked with Nest since 2016, consulting on their curriculum development and program evaluation. I want to take a moment before we begin to thank the incredible teachers and researchers across the country whose work and wisdom made this presentation possible. When Nest asked me to put something together to support educators during COVID, these individuals were extremely gracious and generous with their time and experience, so many thanks to all of them. There's also going to be a survey link after this recording, I believe at the bottom of your screen, and I really hope that you'll take a moment to complete it. The survey is just a few questions long, and it will give you an opportunity to share suggestions and request additional information. Today, our objectives are threefold. First, we're going to talk about child sexual and physical abuse during the pandemic. Next, we'll discuss some strategies for preventing, detecting, and responding to possible risk. And finally, we'll spend some time on self-care and compassion fatigue. The signs of child abuse and neglect during a pandemic are the same as they were before the pandemic. The problem is that we aren't there physically with kids to see them. The signs of abuse include everything listed on this slide and more. During the pandemic, signs of abuse can be misunderstood as signs of stress related to COVID or other national events, which adds an additional layer of complexity to keeping kids safe. But we know that teachers and schools are adapting and innovating in really incredible ways. In addition to the tips I'm sharing during today's presentation, as Nishima mentioned, in the future, Nest will be facilitating opportunities for knowledge sharing through smaller forums and workshops. And if you or someone you know is doing something novel that's working, please share. We'd love to hear from you directly. New federal child abuse and neglect data released in January 2020 showed an increase in the number of victims who suffered maltreatment for the first time since 2015. That was before the pandemic began. We know that abuse in general and sexual abuse in particular is underreported during normal times. In the face of COVID-19, all of this is likely to get worse. During the pandemic, rates of reporting are extremely low. This is a huge problem. And we have reason to believe that while rates of reporting are extremely low, rates of abuse may be increasing. For example, parents might be more stressed and quicker to turn to corporal punishment. And most cases of child sexual abuse are perpetrated by family members or caregivers. This means that a child may be stuck at home with their abuser. We're all dealing with stress, but some of us are experiencing disproportionate hardship. The statistics that are coming out every day illustrate how COVID is exacerbating inequalities along racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, and other lines. Our most vulnerable members of society are now even more so. Social distancing means that students and families no longer get the social and material support that school provides, including access to resources and interactions with teachers and peers. For students and families, this can mean that situations that were tenuous before become worse. It can also mean that families who were previously doing all right are at greater risk. And the increased reliance on online communication modalities can mean increased unsupervised screen time. This in turn means that kids are more likely to be exposed to phishing, exploitation, misinformation, and explicit content online. Overall, the pandemic means a lot of additional risk for students and their families. So what do we do about it? In general, and especially during the pandemic, we want to approach this work from a place of advocacy. The dictionary defines advocacy as the act or process of supporting a cause. In this case, we're supporting students and their families. The fact that you're viewing this workshop suggests to me that you're already interested in working as an advocate. So while some of what I have to say may be new, some of it may sound very familiar. Being an advocate right now is particularly important because given the limitations of e-learning and social distancing during the pandemic, most of the abuse that's detected will be via student report. Students need to know that they can trust teachers and other adults to help. The first thing about being an advocate is just being authentic. Know that you're enough. Just be yourself. Next, as advocates, we need to validate challenges. From the psychotherapy literature, we know how important validation is. It lets people know that they've been heard. Validation promotes connection by letting other people know that what they're going through is indeed hard, and it's understandable that they're having a difficult time. So when a student brings something to you, take a moment. Say, wow, that sounds like you're dealing with a lot. I'm so sorry. Saying that sends a message. Hey, I'm trustworthy and I'm on your side. One of the most important things that we can do for our students and families right now is to facilitate connections to resources and information. That can mean anything from local testing sites, material resources, or information on how to get psychological support. Related to providing resources, but not answers, as advocates, we need to help students and their families problem solve. It can be tempting to come in and solve problems for other people, especially if we think the fix is something obvious or simple. But now more than ever, we want our students and families to experience themselves as people who are capable of finding solutions, even if it's with support from others. This experience of being able to solve problems allows students and their families to experience themselves as agentic and capable, and this in turn builds resilience. Next, as advocates, we want to be flexible and culturally sensitive, especially during the pandemic in which we're suddenly seeing into other people's homes. What might be normative for you may not be for your students or their families. Now is a time for sensitivity. Last but not least, being an advocate means being accountable. If you tell a student that you'll be calling with a resource to help them with their homework on Tuesday at 2, you need to follow through. Maybe something comes up. For some reason you can't find the info you need, or you had to deal with a crisis. That's okay. Call them on Tuesday at 2 anyway. We're all human, and it's all right to say, hey, look, I thought I'd have this information for you, but it's taking longer than I expected, but I'm on it, and we will figure this out together. That follow through lets students know that they can count on us. We're trustworthy adults, and we're on their sides. And advocacy starts from a place of empathy. So we have a brief video on empathy from Brene Brown for you.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
All right. As a researcher, I think about different tiers of intervention. When we think about preventing, detecting, and responding to possible risk during the pandemic, this tiered approach can be really helpful. Tier 1, or universal interventions, are for all students. These interventions are focused on prevention, cultivating resilience, and healthy coping. Putting fluoride in the water is an example of a Tier 1 intervention to promote dental health. Some schools teach the NEST curriculum to, for example, all 10th graders. That's a Tier 1 intervention because everyone gets it. So too is a school-wide implementation of a socio-emotional learning curriculum. Tier 2, or selective interventions, target kids at risk. We suspect that there might be a problem there, or perhaps one is developing. For example, a number of years ago, I worked with community partners to develop and evaluate an intervention to prevent the escalation of online altercations into real-world violence among youth at risk for gun and gang involvement. Our intervention specifically targeted kids we suspected who might be involved, or those who are likely to become gang involved. This made it a Tier 2 intervention. It wasn't for everyone. I'm going to reread that. Tier 2, or selective interventions, target kids at risk. We suspect there might be a problem there, or perhaps one is developing. For example, a number of years ago, I worked with community partners to develop and evaluate an intervention to prevent the escalation of online altercations into real-world violence among youth at risk for gang involvement. Our intervention specifically targeted kids we suspected might be gang involved, or who were likely to become gang involved. This made it a Tier 2 intervention. It wasn't for everyone. Tier 3, or indicated interventions, are used when we know for a fact that there's a problem. In a classroom context, perhaps you identify a student as really struggling with math, so they have an IEP with specific measures put in place to support them in learning. We know there's a confirmed problem and we do something to respond to it. That's a tier 3. Prevention is about prioritizing safety and support, wrapping around students and their families during this time. And so we're going to start here with tier 1. With tier 1 interventions, it's important to remember that the vast majority of teachers and families want the same things: for kids to thrive. So how can we help them do that? The first way is by teaching about healthy coping. This can mean, for example, healthy ways to manage stress, exercise, self-awareness, communicating with others, and connection. Next, we want to provide education about risks. Specifically during this time, information about online risk and safety. So for example, the NEST curriculum does this through digital citizenship and critical analysis of media content. This is particularly important during this time as we're all relying more on technology for communication and connection. Next, and this is so important, students may know more about what's going on with each other than we do. So we need to provide bystander trainings so they know the risk signs and also the resources to get help. The NEST curriculum is an example of a program that does this as well, teaching kids how to intervene when they see a peer in a particular risky situation or a situation that might be risky. And last but not least, we need to create opportunities to cultivate resilience. The research on resilience suggests that resilience is something that all of us have or can have in us. It's not like a gene where you either have it or you don't. Ways to do this include encouraging social connection, giving students experiences in which they get to exercise their agency and develop that sense of like, yes, I'm a person who can do things, and also providing opportunities for creativity and expression. The NEST Resources website has a plethora of really wonderful materials, and I'll link to it at the end. But I wanted to highlight these two, which count as Tier 1 resources. The first is from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and describes different signs and symptoms of COVID-related stress by age group with suggestions for how to help kids cope. The second is an app co-curated by the National Center for PTSD and the VA. It has an incredible amount of information and includes links to local and national resources, including everything from mental health support to places for people to get food, and also tools for self-assessment and stress management. They also have educational content for various ages linked through this app. Moving on to Tier 2. This is about detection. The situations and circumstances that we find ourselves in right now might feel so different that we can sometimes think that we're ill-equipped. But the content of the interactions that we're having now rely on the same experience and expertise that you as educators and school personnel bring into your everyday work in the classrooms and in school buildings. It might feel like you need to do something very different because everything looks very different, but that isn't necessarily true. So this is just a friendly reminder, trust your intuition and your experience. It's also really important to know the signs of child abuse and neglect. I listed some of them earlier. There are also resources on the NEST website that can provide additional information if you feel like you want to brush up. Next, we need to provide students information about what constitutes abuse and the resources that exist to help kids. This is important because kids may not know that what's happening to them isn't okay, and if they don't know that there's help out there, they may not ask for it. Related to this, we need to check in on students. We need to let them know that we care and that we're here. It's particularly important to reach out to students that you have a relationship with. If they knew you already, they'll be more likely to respond and to trust you. And if you suspect something might be going on with a kid, but don't have a good rapport with them, enlist a colleague who does. During these check-in calls, it's important to ask specific questions. How are you doing? How are things at home? How are things with your mom and your dad? I know that you and your brother were really arguing a lot before this whole pandemic. How is it to be stuck at home with him? Asking those specific questions can give students an opportunity to really provide more information, where if you ask just a general, how's it going today? Or something about, saying, I'm just here to check in. Are you okay? That might not elicit the type of response that we need to hear from students if they are really at risk and in danger. We also need to be strategic. So on a video call, observe how a student's house looks. Look for signs of increased frustration, maybe in interactions that you might see between students and other family members. And then think carefully about how we're encouraging students to use technology. So for example, when I started working with NEST to adapt the NEST curriculum for educators to use during the pandemic, we made suggestions about encouraging students to use headphones and sit with their backs to a wall when we shared sensitive content, like information about abuse that could put them at additional risk if an abuser were to see it. We also encourage them to use the chat if they felt unsafe using their voices to respond to a question or to ask questions. Last but not least, it's really important to pay attention to student assignments right now. Student assignments are how students are talking to us. It's how they're letting us know what's going on. And so we really need to read those assignments and pay attention. If something seems off in what a student is writing or submitting, follow up. Since you aren't seeing kids in person, disclosures are a very important way of learning about potential child abuse and neglect. And no two disclosures are the same. So I'm going to take you through a few different types of disclosures that you might encounter. First, we have purposeful disclosures. This is when a victim wants the abuse to stop or is ready to take control in order to change their circumstances. The second type of disclosure is a prompted one. Someone asks if someone has experienced abuse and pulls the story out of them, or in some other way, perhaps through a question or by sharing information, a student is prompted to disclose previous abuse. Next, we have piecemeal disclosures, and that's when kids give us fragments or bits of information. Timelines might not line up, and we're being told pieces of information that we kind of have to string together to really figure out what's going on. And last but not least, there are accidental disclosures. So for example, someone walks in on the abuse happening. It's important, especially in instances of piecemeal and accidental disclosure, to remember that kids who are disclosing in this way are frequently not ready to talk about the abuse. So we need to be extra careful. The main point is that there's no one type of disclosure. You might have a disclosure that catches you off guard, and you might put together bits and pieces of information and then realize you need to make a report after an interaction with the child has already finished. Some kids also might never disclose. Responding to disclosures during the pandemic, so bringing us into tier 3, this is really a balancing act between your responsibility as a mandated reporter and the potential needs of the child who has disclosed. So we've got 3 key things to keep in mind when you're balancing these roles of being an advocate and also a mandated reporter. First, the first thing you want to do is provide validation and support. Thank you so much for telling me that. You're so brave. I'm so sorry that you've had to go through this. It sounds really, really difficult. Let's get you some help and figure this out together. The next thing we want to do is empower by offering options. During the disclosure and follow-up process, this is really important because it gives students a sense of control and agency. Of course, we're not going to ask students, do you want me to report that or not report that, right? If a report needs to get made, it gets made. But we can build little choices into the process. And we know that this is important because of the research and the thought that has gone into trauma-informed care. Choices are a really important piece of providing kids with a trauma-informed response when something terrible is going on. So these choices, as I mentioned, they can be really little. So for example, after a kid has made a disclosure, maybe you see that they're really upset. And then you can offer them, hey, it looks like you're having a really hard time. Why don't you choose something to calm down? Do you want to go into the other room and get a glass of water, or do you want to take 3 deep breaths with me? Just that little choice can begin to give the kid back a sense of control and agency in the situation. You can also give them a choice in how you follow up with them, right? You could say, hey, I'm going to follow up with you in 2 hours. Do you want me to send you a text message or give you a call? And again, super small choice, might seem really simple and straightforward, but really important in starting to get kids grounded again and feeling safe. Last but not least, we need to be transparent. Transparency is critical for maintaining relationships, and we need students and families to feel like we are people who they can trust. They need to know that we're not hiding anything from them and that we'll follow through on next steps, and that we'll be there with them going forward. So transparency can look something like, hey, thank you so much for telling me this. I'm so glad that you did. I need to make a report. This is what I expect to say during the report. Here's what we can expect to have happen after the report. You can even offer to make reports with families on the line, or involve them in other parts of the process in other ways. But transparency is just super important, especially in our current times when everything can feel really scary and foreign and just unknown. We've all been hearing some what ifs during this time, and during these presentations, we've heard some what ifs from teachers and other school personnel, especially around Tier 3 type interventions and reporting. Knowing that one of your students is in a vulnerable position can be really overwhelming, and then not being able to help them the way you might hope can feel devastating and like you're failing. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge these what ifs and how hard all of this is right now. And there are things that we can do. In the future, I think some of the smaller workshops and forums that NEST is going to put together, these may offer opportunities to drill down a bit more, but for right now, what I want to do is offer some really quick responses to some of these what ifs. So first, what if I make the report and nothing happens? That's possible. It's okay to follow up. You can call ACS or DCF. You've got the information about the report, follow up with them, ask them what's happening, ask them what the status of the investigation is. What if I make the report and they close the case? That can be really heartbreaking. But that doesn't mean that all hope is lost. You can gather new information and report again. And it's important that we continue to support kids, even if we make a report and nothing happens. They're still going through really challenging experiences. What if I suspect abuse may be going on, but don't know if I have enough information to report? You can call and ask DCF or ACS. You can say, here's what I have, here's what I think is going on. Do I have enough? What other information do I need? And they'll tell you. And last but not least, I'm concerned about kids who don't have contact with a mandated reporter. We're hearing this a lot, and it's very scary. And it's really important that we get eyes on all of these kids. And this actually brings us to my next point, which is that right now, more than ever, it's critical that we work on teams. We need to work together to get eyes on those kids. Also, if a child is in need of a Tier 2 or a Tier 3 intervention, please don't do it alone. Research suggests that we make our best decisions when we do them together, when we consult and we rely on our colleagues. So reach out to your supervisors or your coworkers. Find someone else in the school who also cares about this kid and get their support. Don't go it alone. Working together will be better for you, and it will also be better for the student. Being an advocate during this pandemic can mean that you are suddenly getting a lot more information about your students than you had before. You might be glimpsing into their homes, for example, and seeing things that can be hard. That's a lot. And so self-care is extremely important. Being an advocate for others also means that we need to take care of ourselves. I love this quote. Audre Lorde writes, "I have come to believe that caring for myself is not self-indulgent. Caring for myself is an act of survival." You aren't only people's teachers or counselors or school administrators. Many of you are also caregivers yourselves, perhaps homeschooling your own kids, caring for elderly relatives, pets. In order to help others, we need to take care of ourselves. We need to put our own oxygen masks on before assisting those in the seats next to us. Secondary traumatic stress is what happens when we hear about terrible things happening to other people. Maybe there are other people we know in our communities. Maybe it's terrible things happening to other people on the news, or things that we find out about in some other way. But really, it's when we're aware of bad things that are happening to other people, but these things aren't happening to us personally. Primary trauma and stress happen when the bad things happen to us personally. So when we bring together secondary traumatic stress, this understanding that bad things are happening in the world to other people, with primary trauma and stress, the knowledge that bad things are also happening in our own lives and to ourselves, and that we are dealing with difficulty during these times, that can lead to compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue feels exhausting. You might feel frustrated or angry or depressed. It's the opposite of compassion satisfaction, which is the joy we derive from being in professions where we provide care and support others, for example, through teaching. Compassion fatigue, in turn, can lead to burnout. Burnout can come from feeling overwhelmed, like we can't make a difference, and it's all too much, right? We just feel like we can't do it anymore. This graphic is really great and comes from the Compassion and Resilience Toolkit, which has wonderful resources for educators, schools, and families. We may start out as zealots, out to save the world, but after a little bit, we're likely to find ourselves becoming increasingly irritable and withdrawing, possibly from those who can help us take care of ourselves. The zombie phase sets in when everything feels overwhelming and too much, even though we're already withdrawing and we just can't keep it up anymore. At that point, either we refuel and practice compassion resilience, or we leave our professions because we just can't keep it up. So I want to take a moment to take us through a brief self-care assessment, and I encourage you to really spend some more time on this. There's a PDF version available on the Nest resources page, and while it might seem silly, this is actually really, really important and can be really helpful. The first thing to do is ask yourself, what is the self-care practice that you did in the past that really worked for you that you no longer do? And then why did you stop? So for example, I used to run, but then it got cold out, and so then I stopped. Next, I want you to ask yourself, what are you doing now in the present that's working well for you? Do you think you'll continue it? What could interfere with you continuing it? And last but not least, I want you to ask yourself, what is one self-care practice you would like to try to commit to in the future? Why have you not tried it before or committed to it yet? And what needs to happen for you to make that commitment? This could be something that you did before and want to start doing again. It could be something completely new, or maybe it's that thing that you're doing right now that's working pretty well. And if you feel like, I have no idea, right? Where do I even begin with self-care? I have 7 suggestions specifically for educators. The first one is connect with other people. Social connection, social support are so important right now, especially when we're physically distant. Next, rely on healthy rituals and routines. Rituals and routines can give us a sense of certainty, we know what to expect, and they can also give us a sense of control, which can be really comforting during these times. Next, I invite you to remember your values. I imagine that you entered into your professions because of some of the core values that you hold, the things that are important to you. Tap back into those things. That can be an act of self-care. Next, I think right now, especially during the pandemic, it's really important for each of us to focus on our own versions of balance, not what balance looks like for our partners or our best friends or our aunts or our uncles or our neighbors or even ourselves last year. What does balance look like for you right now? All of the comparison that people can engage in, all of those, kind of thoughts about, gosh, that person looks like they're coping so well, or I wish I could be doing as well as my colleague. She seems to be having a really easy time of it. Or even, I feel like I'm doing so much better than other people. So both those upward comparisons as well as those downward comparisons, those can be really draining and toxic. So I encourage you right now to just focus on your version of balance and remember that that's a form of self-care too. Next, we can practice self-awareness. This is really just mindfulness. It's observing ourselves as outsiders. Sometimes people will use their 5 senses to practice mindfulness, but at its core, mindfulness is just about being aware in the present moment. Next, we can all practice gratitude. I've started writing down 3 things that I'm grateful for every morning. Some mornings it's easier than others, but it's a good reminder and good grounding, and nice to look back on. And those mornings that I have a hard time, or I might have a hard time figuring out what to be grateful for, I can flip back in my planner and see, what was I grateful for yesterday? How about the day before? Am I still grateful for those things? And tapping into that gratitude can be a really beautiful self-care practice as well. Last but not least, just laugh. My mom told me this joke that apparently everyone else, every other adult in America has heard before, but I hadn't. She called me up early on Mother's Day and asked me if my refrigerator was working. And very concerned, I went and checked and I said, yeah, but Mom, are you okay? Is yours? And she said, well, honey, go catch it. And I laughed. And that laughter felt like a break. So watch a funny movie, get a kid to tell you a joke, do something, and just let yourself laugh. Here's the link to the NEST resources page. Nishima and her colleagues have done a really beautiful job finding resources and curating them here. They're updating them frequently, so check back. The resources on this page include everything from COVID response and abuse reporting resources to what to look for signs of abuse and neglect, and other resources that are organized both nationally and also for some specific locations. I also really hope that you will fill out the post-workshop survey. As I mentioned at the beginning of our time together, it's short. It will take you just a few minutes, and it will give you an opportunity to make suggestions and requests for future workshop topics. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Corianna, so much for sharing your knowledge. We hope that this has been useful to all of you, that it reinforced some things you already knew or it introduced you to some new topics. As Corianna said, we do have that resources page available to you. You can find all of that at our website, nestfoundation.org. Over this last few weeks, we have been collecting input from all of you about what is of most concern and top priority So as you fill out your surveys, please continue to share that with us as we develop new materials and new workshops for you. And you'll be able to learn about when those will be up by visiting nestfoundation.org and signing up for our newsletter. We'll be sharing out with all of you when those become available. For now, thank you all for your time. Please do fill out that survey, and we appreciate you and all that you do so very much. Thank you.